So the next section's pretty interesting, to be honest. This has come from a few sources, but I thought I'd go for opposites and ends, and I went to the Moscow Times and the New York Post, and both papers pretty much say the same thing, as well as many other papers from the UK and from around Europe. So the leaks also contain information from papers belonging to the US National Security Agency, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff Directorate for Intelligence, in which Russian infighting is discussed, specifically infighting between Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB, and its defense ministry over the true scale of Russian casualties in Ukraine, which they've reported. The FSB has also been critical of the defense ministry's death toll, not including casualties suffered by the Russian National Guard, the Wagner Group, or fighters under the command of Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, as revealed by the leaks. So basically they're unhappy at the fudging of the numbers. Again, this has been reported by several sources, two of which are the Moscow Times and the New York Post. In September, what's also being shown as well is in September, Sergei Shoigu, if I pronounced that correctly, the Russian defense minister, announced that 5,937 Russian soldiers had been killed in Ukraine since the war began. I would have thought it was more than that.
Yeah.
No subsequent death toll from the Russian side has been made public since then. The FSB calculated that the actual number of Russians wounded and killed in action was closer to 110,000. One document cited by the New York Times reads, official US estimates of Russian casualties over the past year total around 200,000. However, documents made public in the earlier leak put this figure somewhere between 189,500 and 223,000, including as many as 43,000 dead. While the New York Times was unable to independently verify the documents, US officials consulted on the matter did not actually dispute the information revealed. So quite a bit of a story there. Sorry about that, Jim. But it pretty much shows a level of infighting and a level of detail that the that the American intelligence services actually have on what's going on within Moscow itself and between its agencies. And it would imply that they have some, like we were discussing earlier, it would imply that they've got some intelligence assets in Russia, which we already knew. But this isn't really something you want the Russians knowing you know.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, everyone expected America would have intelligence over there. Otherwise, how would they know what to send and how to help without actually helping, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
But yeah, as you said, they wouldn't want this to be public. Everyone knew they knew, but they didn't want to know how they knew.
Yeah.
So they didn't want to make public how they knew. Yeah, confusing.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, it reveals that the US have actual assets deep in Russian Central Command, and again, what we were saying earlier, these specific sets of data, it could narrow down who the assets actually are for the Russians as well to put a stop to it.
Yeah.
Aside from that, the data itself does actually show the stalemate situation, because we've already spoken about the Ukrainian side taking heavy casualties, but you and I, we're not pro-Russia, we're just trying to get to the truth of it. This shows horrendous casualties on both sides.
Yeah, which we knew anyways. But, I mean, the war has been going on for quite a while now, so it makes sense that there are a lot of casualties, and the supplies is becoming an issue. Not only supplies, but manpower as well. But it was a bit difficult to have a clear insight as to what amount this is a problem for both sides.
Oh, yeah.
These documents certainly painted a more accurate picture, but yeah, then you could argue how much you can trust these documents. But yeah, as they're branded as leaks, I would say they're somewhat accurate. I think
it's the fact as well that US officials have verified the data is actually true without verifying the documents.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the New York Times is claiming that. So just a disclaimer for me and you, that it's just that's what the New York Times is claiming.
Right.
So if true, it paints a bleak scene, but it also shows how, we've spoken a lot about NATO fracturing, but it also shows Russian dissent as well, how it's not the internal organizations and it's, of its intelligence services and the government, they're not as unified as we would have thought. I mean, we know that the Russian population, a large chunk of them, don't want this war either.
Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне!
Господи, как это называется? Указ, не указ? Что там он распоряжение отдал о своих этих о начале военных действий? Он должен это прекратить. Вот. Что для этого нужно сделать, я не знаю. Все, что мы можем, это просто сказать, что не согласны.
Потому что мы считаем, что все конфликты должны решаться мирным путем, без применения насилия в чью-либо сторону.
In Russia, anti-war demonstrators are paying tribute to Ukrainian civilians killed earlier this month by that massive Russian airstrike earlier in Dnipro. As Breyer Stewart tells us, the protests are in defiance of an unrelenting Kremlin crackdown.
I mean, you have a number of makeshift memorials that have popped up across Russia, including in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they've popped up in response to the deadly attack in Dnipro earlier this month, where a missile struck an apartment building, killing at least 46 people, injuring dozens of others. Now, after that attack, people started showing up at different places in these cities, leaving flowers and stuffed animals. And in Moscow, they turned up to a statue dedicated to a famous Ukrainian playwright, Lesia Ukrainka. And so they turned up there, leaving things, in some cases saying prayers. And when they did that, they were under the watchful eye of the police. In fact, a police van was parked right nearby. And human rights groups say at least 6 Russians have been detained for turning up at the memorial in Moscow. And because even though people are there to show their sympathy, the Russian government takes that as a direct criticism of them. And
Нет войне! 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 Требую незамедлительно покинуть место проведения мероприятия и прекратить нарушение общественного. Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне!
Я не хочу этой войны. Почти никто ее здесь не хочет. Я хочу, чтобы весь мир увидел, что мы не хотим этого. И мы не хотим, чтобы на нашей совести лежало это пятно. Нет войне!
Нет войне! Нет войне!
Настоящий фашизм, это недопустимо. И что, в общем-то, сейчас у каждого есть обязанность не молчать о происходящем, все должны высказываться против.
Вступление вообще и против России, и против Украины. Я считаю, что эта война, она убивает и Россию, и Украину. Я возмущена.
Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне! Нет войне!
Ну, надо прекратить. Этого нельзя. Это безумие, то, что сейчас происходит. Мы должны все вместе кричать «нет войне» и все выходить на улицы, потому что по-другому нельзя. По-другому мы Россию потеряем. Не только Украину, мы Россию потеряем.
Представители СМИ, отходим в сторону.
Много людей не собиралось, чтобы они не говорили, что...
Почему ты там сидишь?
Все будет хорошо, ты мне веришь?
Хорошо, почему ты там сидишь?
Потому что задача, чтобы много людей не собиралось, и чтобы они не говорили, что они против войны, понимаешь?
And I actually feel it's not being said enough that when we're talking about dead Russian soldiers, a lot of these soldiers, especially at the start of the war, these were people forced, against their will to go. A lot of them were unemployed, they were homeless, and they were told go fight.
Всем привет, на связи первый танковый полк. Нам официально сказали, что подготовки перед отправкой в зону боевых действий не будет. Официальные командиры полка подтвердили эту информацию. 29-го у нас отправка предстоит в Херсон. Поэтому думайте сами, решайте сами, что делать с этим в дальнейшем.
Никакой переподготовки от слова того, что ни стрельб, ни теоретической подготовки.
Ни теории, ничего.
Нихуя.
Ось у нас
Первый
пленный. Взял и вообще без единого выстрела. С танчика вообще скинули нахуй. Танчик поломаний, нихуя не стріляє. Тобто стрілять, нихуя не їде. Це все з верхньої сироватки. Хвальона Т-90 єбуча, путінська. Хай знають, блядь, нашого брата.
Скоро скажет «Слава Украине!»
Да,
Героям слава! Через полчаса!
Кричи, кажи, слава Україні. Кажи давай.
Ми остановимося зараз на турі.
Остановимось,
скажи «Слава Україні!»
Громче.
Героям слава!
Молодець.
Оце молодець.
There have been countless protests in Russia where the protesters have been arrested for protesting against the war. This is a video in itself, but there's that odd case of the journalist, I don't know if you know, where she protested the war on TV and people are saying it was a plant, it was fake, and she's saying it's not, it's psychological. So there has been dissent in Russia, and I actually personally feel that it's not spoken about enough in the media. I mean, what do you think?
Sorry, what do I think about exactly?
Russian opposition to the war.
Yeah, I mean, it was known, as you said, like there's been a lot of protests, and there's been also, as you said, a lot of arrests of people protesting. There was also cases that we mentioned in previous podcasts where, the troops would just surrender straight up, like giving the arms as well. I mean, this war is it's more political in a sense that it's like Putin versus Zelensky. The actual population, to its most part, I don't believe wanted the war. And especially now, a lot more must have been fed up with it, including, on the battlefield work, there's been a lot of non-militant personnel that caught in the crossfire, and we had victims and stuff. So it makes sense that there's a lot of people that would oppose the war, but these people would be not directly associated with the government, with either government, I believe.
Yeah. One thing, and that's being pushed around, and I think there might be some truth to it, because, to be honest, the only real attempt at peace we've seen was the Chinese peace proposal that they put forward. And, even the Polish government said, hey, we should actually look at this, But the EU and Biden immediately rejected it. And it kind of, like, I'm not just, we have Putin's expansionism here. You know, Putin wanting to basically conquer and eradicate Ukraine and absorb it back into Russia, which is not justified at all. But it seems at the same time that NATO is not really, it doesn't seem to be that motivated to find a peaceful solution to this. Well, I mean, it's doubtful one could be found at this point, even though I think one needs to happen. But at the earlier stages, they seemed very reluctant to go for peace talks. Even Zelensky offered peace talks initially, but then just utterly backed out of them once he started getting NATO intervention. And obviously we were getting reports of lots of Ukraine victories, and he said he wouldn't come to the table. Yeah. What do you think on that one?
I think that people also make money on the back of the war. So they would like to prolong it. B, if the war was to end, it will have to end under specific, not circumstances, but under specific like clauses. Like if a peace treaty was to be agreed, there had to be certain clauses that not just Ukraine and Russia agrees upon, but NATO and USA and all the other who got involved.
Oh yeah.
So at this point, it's not just two countries that need to agree, but a lot more, which will make the whole treaty a lot more complicated.
Oh yeah.
So if the war is to end, I don't think it will end with a peace treaty, but it's going to be that one will win and the other will lose one way or another. But yeah, that's what I think basically.
Oh yeah. I mean, you know, you're right. NATO is fully entrenched in this war now. I mean, short of, you know, actual soldiers. Well, short
not only
of
NATO, but USA as well, from based on these documents.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was just gonna say they're absolutely involved, short of like sending in mass amounts of infantry. Obviously, I can't say boots on the ground because these documents do dispute that because of special forces on the ground, even if they're in an advisory capacity.
Yeah, but the point is that in case of a peace treaty, because of that, because of the involvement, these countries have a say on the clauses in the peace treaty.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it gets quite complicated because of that.
And what makes it more complicated is, and this is the last I'll touch on it, because obviously we've got more papers to get through. Just to top it off, what makes it more complicated is it can backfire on peace talks altogether, and Putin can claim that this is just NATO expansionism, and that can make the peace treaty, that can make any peace talks even more difficult.
Well, yeah. Similarly, they can say that this is like too much in favor of Putin, and Putin is in the wrong when he started the whole of that. So therefore, any sort of fair peace treaty that may or may not be good for Russia, even if it's fair, they might argue that, hey, you started the war, you shouldn't expect any sort of privileges out of it. Well, I think the time period where we could have a peace treaty has been is long gone.
Yeah, I think so. I hope we're wrong. Don't get us wrong. I'm not saying that anything other than I hope we're wrong. You know, for the sake of, you know, people who are currently dying.
Obviously,
I hope we're wrong.
But everything else indicates otherwise, which is sad.
And it's kind of like a chicken before the egg, because Putin would say, well, I invaded because of NATO expansion, but your invasion, Putin has pushed Finland and Sweden to join NATO because they've just seen you invade Ukraine in what's a full-scale war with mass casualties.
Yeah.
So it's just escalated the situation more and more. We are actually working on a Ukraine series, so a lot of these subjects Jim and I are going to touch on in a lot more detail. Jim, have you got anything more you want to add before we move on to the next one? Or?
Not really. I pretty much think I covered everything I wanted to say.
So another interesting one is something quite clandestine. It's one thing to have all of your assets in, I really don't want to say Russia's an enemy country because, you know, I don't like the idea of World War III or you know, a large-scale war, but they are pretty much an enemy of NATO at this point. It's one thing to have assets in a hostile nation, but to be caught eavesdropping on your allies, to be caught spying on your allies, that's very clandestine. You are not supposed to do it. Obviously it does go on though, and one of the papers does actually indicate that the US is implied by the documents to have potentially eavesdropped on allies South Korea. This one's pretty damning. The US has always had an interest of maintaining an alliance network in Asia, going as far back as the Russian Civil War. One of the reasons Woodrow Wilson sent troops to Siberia was to prevent Japanese expansion into it, and also establish an American access point into the Asian market. Vietnam, one of the reasons is suggested by Eisenhower that America stayed in the war in Vietnam. One of the reasons was to show dedication and stability to American allies in the region. For example, Malaysia, there was a bit of civil war where both sides wanted an end to it and they were on the verge of negotiating, and the US staying in Nam pushed their assets in Malaysia to keep the war going, provided motivation for their allies to stay in the fight. The other one was America being a source of strength and an alternative to China. Furthermore, just to reinforce one last point, the US attempted to create an Asian version of NATO, CETO, in order to combat communism. So the point I'm just making is they've always maintained a sphere of influence in this area of the world. So, and also given the situation of South Korea and North Korea, they're not going to want to damage relations with South Korea or allies in Japan, or make themselves look like a liability in this region of the world. It would be very counter to their foreign policy.
Yeah.
So these leaks could destabilize, their image. Spying on an ally is said is very clandestine. So basically, the US has been caught speaking about their actual policy of not wanting to give supplies to wars directly. They'll give supplies to allies, but they'll not do it to intervene in conflict. They have a policy against that. And the US has basically intercepted communications between them, as implied by the documents potentially. Kim Ta-hyo, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, First Deputy Director of National Security Office in South Korea, has claimed all documents are fabricated in an interview. The footage also shows the Secretary of Defense, the American one, standing next to his South Korea counterpart, with both governments declaring their alliance as strong as ever, but is still very embarrassing for the US and may harm their influence in the region. Just one last bit of narrative, specifically, the document also. Before I move on to that bit. So yeah, that's what's happened. They've leaked a couple of secrets of South Korea, and they've done South Korea's done the normal thing. None of it's true. Alliance is as strong as ever.
As one of its strongest allies claims that South Korea has been spied upon by the US, has sent the administration here into damage control overdrive. South Korea's defense minister has spoken with his US counterpart to reassure each other their alliance is as strong as ever, both pointing out they believe a number of the leaked documents are false.
Many of the disclosed documents are fabricated, and our joint assessments are consistent with each other.
But the government hasn't said if it believes the documents relating to South Korea are fake or genuine.
They purportedly relate to sensitive government conversations about the provision of artillery shells needed by Ukraine. Seoul doesn't supply them directly so as not to anger Moscow, but South Korean officials are alleged to have discussed ways of supplying shells indirectly through third countries.
The alleged discussions are not that revealing, but what's more concerning here is the fact that they might have come through eavesdropping.
We believe that if it's true, it would be a very disappointing situation that damages the trust-based alliance between Korea and the US.
It's also led to questions about how the security-conscious administration of President Yoon Suk-yeol could allow itself to be spied upon, and whether his decision to move his office away from the traditional Blue House compound allowed a security lapse.
When he got elected last year, unpreparedly moved out of that long-established presidential office and moved to this current former military headquarters. So the opposition party has criticized, among many other reasons, the security issues.
It's all the more embarrassing coming just 2 weeks before a long-anticipated summit in Washington with US President Joe Biden, seen as a reward for South Korea's unstinting loyalty, when the two men will be smiling for the cameras in spite of allegations that one ally has been spying on the other. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
They were never going to do anything other than that.
Yeah.
But
I mean, that's their standard answer to everything, really, and it has worked pretty well.
Oh yeah,
for Malaysia, for the most part.
Off the camera, though.
Yeah.
They'll be pissed.
Yep, I bet.
But
yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh no, you go ahead.
Yeah, off the camera, it might be another shitstorm, basically.
Mm-hmm.
which I don't think we'll hear. But from the one hand, you see they're saying that everything's good, we're allies, yada yada. But not too long ago, we had like this discussion with TikTok about, because TikTok is from China.
Yeah.
And it was the argument as to how much of your data is being used for spying you, basically. Sorry, I'm just struggling to articulate at this point. But basically, yeah, it was a big fuss about it. There was even some sort of a court case as well, where they brought the creator of TikTok onto it. It was another shit show, but for different reasons. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is that there is already some tension between America and Asia in general.
Yeah. I mean, when you're trying to look like the strong power and your data leaks are dragging a lot of people into the cesspool you've created, that can be pretty damaging.
Yep.
With this though, because the nature of the leaks is that the US are complaining that South Korea isn't doing enough. They're actually complaining in these documents a bit that the allies aren't doing enough. And it suggests that the US is trying to push more allies into giving more aid to Ukraine. I mean, I fully appreciate this isn't really a revelation, but it does show the desperation they have with this request. Because this is a crucial time in the US, and NATO isn't as solidified as their public image presents. NATO armies, for example, can only augment the US army in a modest way. Britain, France, Germany, for example, most likely couldn't produce a 30,000 strong force in a war zone. And to be honest, none of those. Well, I know the UK definitely doesn't. The Germans and the French have really low ammunition counts. Britain only has enough ammo to sustain actual warfare fighting for like 2 days or something like that.
When this integrated review was written, over a year ago, the world looked very different. And what we're now seeing are strains on our armed forces, particularly our three conventional forces, which means that they are becoming overwhelmed. So we cut our troop numbers by 10,000, and yet here we are committing 2 battle groups to Estonia, along with all the other commitments we have around the world. We've reduced our F-35 fleet from 138 to just 48. So that's probably enough to put on our 2 aircraft carriers, but not enough if we wanted to bolster our eastern flank of NATO. And we are simply running out of ammunition as well. We've gifted so much equipment to the Ukrainians. We now recognize that there'll be a shortfall were we to take on Russia ourselves. If the amount of ammunition that Ukraine is expending, if we were into war, we'd run out in 2 weeks.
And they have, among other things, they've got a ridiculously low amount of artillery guns. And obviously, you and I know artillery is a key thing is a key factor in the Ukrainian war right now.
Yeah. Especially with how the battlefield is geographically, like the hills and stuff and whatnot, because it's unlike England. These areas over there are not flat.
Yeah.
So artillery helps in that aspect.
I think we all do. Nobody wants to bitch about it. You know, we're here, we're volunteering, so it's not like it's going to be, you know, the U.S. or the British military where the intelligence levels and things are set higher. The baseline is higher.
Yeah.
Here, you know, things are different. We operate a lot differently here. The expectations for fighting, a lot of the guys we all agree it really hasn't been met, but that, in a sense, isn't our fault either. The Russians, they don't like a good fight. They would rather pull back and, you know, bomb the shit out of stuff and just destroy it before they lose it.
And can you talk about that? Because we spoke before about some of the ground taken was more given up by the Russians, so then they could pull back and then just flatten it. Is that correct?
Yeah, that happens often. If they start to lose, I mean, it's kind of similar to what ISIS would do, where they would just pull back and kill the civilians and leave. Here, they just pull back and drop bombs. You know, they'll level it, and instead of losing it, similar to what they said about, you know, I heard what they said about the power plant kind of thing is, if they can't have it, no one's going to kind of thing. And I think that is the way their mindset is for all these villages and in the land that they've taken. Is if the Ukrainians start to make an advance, they like to pull back and just fucking level everything.
I think with the exception of the US Army, which might not be at its strongest, it's still strong. I think Finland helps NATO more than NATO helps Finland to some extent in terms of the actual military output it has.
I mean, that's why I was surprised when I heard that they would be joining NATO. Like, they were fine on their own. In fact, they didn't need NATO. NATO needed them more than they needed NATO. Even if Russia decided to invade Finland, which it hasn't worked in the past, may I add.
I think
I was quite taken aback and surprised by this move, and I think it's a mistake because at the end of the day, it will bring more obligations than gains. But hey, that's my opinion.
Oh no, absolutely. Yeah, very much so. Finnish public opinion shifted more towards joining NATO with the sight of the Ukrainian invasion. Because I've spoken to a few Finns. Some of them are former members of the defense force, and the opinion is of Finland that Russia would have a good chance of winning, but it would completely destroy Russia's army if they were to do it. It would completely wreck Russia as a war machine, because obviously Finland has we produced a video on it. Finland has a hell of a defensive line. They have something like 700 artillery guns on the defensive line, and they've got a huge army as well as a huge reserve army. So it would be the end of the Russian war machine if they did it. But you know, the Finnish government and the Finnish people don't want their country, you know, wrecked by the war that would ensue from it. So I think when they saw the invasion of Ukraine and saw it actually happening, because I've got to say I was surprised. Part of me was surprised Putin went through with it when he was doing the exercises on the border. They've gone to NATO for security. And again, it's the invasion of Ukraine that's pushed both them and Sweden to do it. And that's one thing NATO does do. It gives them that security of national community. You know, you invade a NATO state, the rest of NATO gets involved legally and has to get involved militarily. So they're hoping that is one of the final things that would put Putin off. But the Finnish, you know, will want to keep their military assets in Finland because they are on the border with Russia. You know, and that's very understandable. I don't actually know what Finland are contributing to the Ukraine, if anything. But I know there's reluctance to, for example, give any of their Leopards over because they need them themselves, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually something I'd like to go into just quickly as well, because obviously you've got Poland and the Baltic states. Now, Poland themselves are, again, there's the claim that there's 20,000 troops. I'm not treating that one seriously because I'm sorry, but radio chatter, hearing Polish radio chatter, you need more than that. So if the former army officers are saying that and they have their own sources, that's fine. But until Jim and I hear better sources that's true, I'm not saying it is true. I imagine there might be Polish mercenaries, but the Poles have, you know, offered jets, they've offered tanks. I know that they're talking about donating some of their Leopards. Again, none of the Leopards have seen it, but I would think the Polish and the Baltic states would be reluctant to hand over mass amounts of aid because they'll be looking at what's happening in Ukraine and they'll be concerned about Putin's expansionism into their territories, especially Poland and the Baltic states. So, you know, they'll want to keep their military assets in their countries should they need to defend themselves, you know?
Yeah.
But it also shows something else. It shows that the US, for so long, the US throughout history has always come along with blank checks. Even, back in the days of Vietnam, they would always come along with a blank check. They'd build armies, they'd augment armies, they'd buy supplies. And obviously, I'm not going to go too much into Biden's domestic policy, but let's just say that the US economy isn't the strongest at the moment. It's a combination of world factors to do with energy, what's happening with the Ukraine war, and yeah, unfortunately, I'm actually quite left-wing, and I'm willing to call this out. Some of Biden's policies have just ran the US economy into the ground, like producing more and more money and causing inflation. The US economy isn't really in a position where it can be the main investor in this kind of interventionist foreign policy anymore. It can't just keep continuously giving equipment over, it can't just endlessly pump equipment into these war zones anymore. That's why this shows kind of a weakness in NATO, because the US are desperate to get more countries putting more weapons in Ukraine. Am I making sense with that?
Yeah, basically, this is not a problem where you can just throw more money and ammunition to it until it gets solved.
Absolutely.
It's the general sort of conclusion, if I understand this correctly, what you're trying to make, or the point you're trying to make.
It's partly that. You're absolutely right, by the way. That is absolutely, I agree with that 100%. I'm just saying the US can't even afford to try and continuously throw money until the end of eternity anymore.
Yeah, no.
They've already run out of they haven't run out of javelins, but they've gone danger low, so they can't give any more to the Ukrainians. Even their ammunition.
From what they say, because I don't believe they are running low. I think that they are saying they're running low, so they don't have to send more. But
it could be that.
On the other hand, I don't think it was that long ago where they had to use that infinite money glitch where they just print more money in the treasury.
Has no
It wasn't
consequences
that long ago
whatsoever.
when that happened. So yeah,
The
they are
official
trying to be cautious. Yeah, they are trying to be cautious because of that.
The official US statement for the javelins is that they've gotten to a point where they have to keep a reserve stockpile for other conflicts that may come about. So they can't donate any more to Ukraine. They've got to keep enough for their own army, and they've got to keep enough for other conflicts should they, reappear. I think we've discussed this before. Just as a brief reminder, javelins can take 5 years to build. So refilling these things can, refilling the stockpiles can take a long time. Or, as you say, Jim, it could be the case they don't want to give any. Either way, America's hitting its limit. How much it can give. I mean, even the ammunition stockpiles are being used up, and that tells me as well that I'm going to put myself out here. The level of fighting in Ukraine is at an intensity that we've not seen in a while in terms of just how consistent the fighting is.
Yeah.
Because it just seems like none of the NATO armies are actually prepared for it, if that makes sense.
Well, how could they be?
Yeah. And there's also something else as well, just within the actual area, within the actual Asian area. I remember America is alone in Asia in terms of a country, in terms of its intervention there. It's on its own. There's not that much NATO physical support in Asia, so America's trying to show itself as a source of strength over there as well. So that's what that could damage. But
true.
Moving on to the next one, Jim, before we do that, you got anything else you want to say on that one?
No, not really.
Something was leaked on Serbia. Now, again, I imagine this will have pissed the Serbian government off, because this is not something that the Serbian government would want leaked. This one is very damning. Serbia was the only country in Europe to refuse to implement sanctions to Russia and openly held parades celebrating the invasion of Ukraine. However, according to the Times, I'll read out the extract. Showing a chart entitled Europe Responds to Ongoing Russia-Ukraine Conflict, the document revealed that Serbia had declined to provide military training to Ukrainian forces, but had committed to supply weapons or had sent them already. The chart sets out the assessed positions of 38 European countries in response to Ukraine's request for military aid to counter the Russian invasion. The chart dated March 2nd and labelled NOROFN, prohibiting its distribution to foreign militaries and intelligence agencies, also said that Serbia has the capability and political will to provide more weapons to Ukraine in the future. So that contradicts the public image they were trying to show the world of, celebrating the Russian invasion. And also thank you for Novara Media for showing that excerpt of a Times article which is behind a paywall. This, like I said, this. If I was the Serbian government, I'd be pissed off as hell, because not only has this undermined Serbia's position, because remember, they have economic trade with Russia, because there is an aspect of, to provide aid to Ukraine, you're basically tanking your economy, because there's an economic war going on here with energy. If you're dependent on Russia for gas supplies.
Yeah, totally. And there is also no statement they can make to, deny this or whatever.
Yeah. And it shows, as an example, as a story to extrapolate from, the Serbian government could say, look, Biden, we said we'd give the weapons over, we said we'd help you, we could have even been an intelligence asset to you, but this had to be in confidence. Well, now it's being leaked and Putin knows.
Yeah. I mean, it was supposed to be in confidence. We obviously didn't plan for it to be leaked, but it did get leaked. So, yeah, shit happens. It is what it is.
Yep. I mean, it's like I said, I'm of the opinion that these documents were just left around. Like, I think this is just a human error fuck up. Like, I do believe what people are saying about how we don't have these things backed up on servers. We have these things locked up. Oh, I believe all that. I'm just saying human error can undermine all that. You know what I mean?
Yep.
This is the kind of thing where you find the guy who did this and say, yeah, maybe you shouldn't have done that one. Basically, this is going to come as no surprise. Serbian government is denying everything. I don't blame them, to be honest. One thing as well is, in this region of the world as well, or near this region, the Afghanistan withdrawal. A point I was going to make earlier is a lot of people are saying that Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, I'm not sure how much I believe this, was to free up resources and money for the intervention that might be needed in Ukraine. Now, one thing I think does show that could be true is the interview you found where the Ukrainian government was preparing for a Russian invasion in 21-22. You can bet they'll have spoken to the US about potential help, especially after Crimea. So, there might have been that might have been a hand in it, but it's also the fact people are saying Biden just wanted to say on the eve of 9/11 that we pulled out of Afghanistan. But the Afghanistan withdrawal was a disaster. Now, why am I talking about that? You had images of the planes lifting off after he said, this will not be like the fall of Saigon, and we got the tragic story of the planes lifting off and people dying, getting crushed, clinging onto the wheels and falling to their death.
Seeing a snapshot there of one of the saddest days in perhaps international history in decades. What we are now seeing is the complete collapse of Afghanistan. The Taliban entered the city yesterday, the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, and today there's absolute utter chaos, with the biggest, saddest story being the desperate effort by thousands of people to get out of Afghanistan by somehow or the other getting onto a handful of aircraft. These are military aircraft operated by the US, a couple of airlines which managed to get flights operating before airspace over Afghanistan was completely shut down. This is a military aircraft, a US C-17, as you can see right above the wheels on the fairing of the undercarriage. You've got people over there just hanging on. This plane actually took off, as did a couple of other C-17 transports, and people fell off to their deaths. There is video of them falling off these aircraft, and there is video and pictures of their dead bodies as well.
Clinging onto the plane wings, desperate to get out. We basically had a disaster, and then the bomb at the airport. It was a disastrous withdrawal. It was a fuck up, to put it bluntly.
Yeah.
And that will have undermined America's position of strength in the region, because Biden was told, specifically, I won't go into this too long. Biden was told, if you pull out these troops, if you take away the Air Force, if you take away the mechanics, all that the Afghan military knows how to do is point fire at a building and then fire a lot of bullets to cover up the sound of jets as they call in an airstrike and take out the target. That's all they know how to do. Or that's what they were strongest at. He cuts the nuts off of the Afghan military, who were badly trained, by the way, and that wasn't just Biden. That was across a few prime ministers and a few presidents. And, of course, the Taliban take over. If you're in that region of the world and you're looking at the US as a source of strength, you're going to look at that and think, what the hell are they doing?
Yeah.
And the documents actually reflect this, because Serbia, not wanting to be publicly associated with the US, which makes sense for them, but also more in the Asian region, you've got the US within the Arab world specifically. So Egypt, for example, was going to send weapons secretly, including 40,000 rockets, artillery rounds, etc., and gunpowder to Russia. And there's a few more going into the UAE, the Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates. They also want to work against US and UK intelligence, though they've denied this. This shows that the alliance in this region for the US are falling apart, and implies NATO is fracturing. The influence in the Middle East seems to be fragile. Plus, recent negotiations between Iran and the UAE conducted by China really doesn't portray a strong coalition for the US in that region anymore. What do you think?
In regards to what exactly?
Basically having a coalition of nations that would be under the American sphere of influence in the Middle East.
Don't believe that's something that is feasible.
It's
Because
certainly
on the
not
one
now.
hand, yeah, but on the other, China wants to be independent. Korea is also, everyone wants to be independent. They want to be in good terms, but independent enough to do their own thing. So, on the other hand, USA wants to increase influence. You already have a collision right there.
Yeah.
So I don't see how that would work, personally.
Well, I agree, because in terms of, China's coming along, and already Iran and other countries are already siding with them, and America is losing its influence with the allies it thought it had, and the documents are actually showing that. So
yeah, exactly.
America's losing its international standing, and I don't think this is just Joe Biden, by the way. I think this is with Trump. I even think this was going back to Obama, and I think NATO has been fracturing for a while.
There is a sort of global segregation which we can see, like in terms of watching the economy. Everyone is already talking about a second sort of economic collapse at the global level. We have the energy crisis, which is also global, which supposedly it's the result between Ukraine and Russia. And don't get me wrong, that definitely played a role, but I think in one way or another this energy crisis would happen anyways.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, there is a general global degradation, so it's not just USA's sort of that's degrading and losing influence.
I mean, one thing as well is, remember how I said they can't afford to have this like blank check giving everybody everything to maintain its bribery for a coalition type of thing. One of the things that's also contributed to this, in addition to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, producing the Taliban-controlled nation, you have the fact that they, moved all of their the majority of their spending out of the region and injected it into Eastern Europe as well. So that might have cost them a lot of favor.
Yeah, quite possibly.
And so far, is at time of recording, that's the leaks we have so far. I imagine by the time this gets out, some more will have been dropped, but at time of recording, that's what's being made public, at least by the papers. To be honest, some broad analysis, unless there's anything else you want to say in relation to the Middle Eastern coalition.
Not really. I pretty much said everything I wanted to cover and say, from my part.
Yep. So just some overall arching points, really. I honestly think these leaks will undermine the US in the eyes of its NATO allies. Special forces data is being leaked, as well as what the US knows. Holland, France, etc. have had their names dropped. South Korea's had their names dropped. Serbia's had their names dropped. The fact that a National Guard leaked this on Discord to his gamer friends just makes this look even worse. It would be something out of a sitcom if it wasn't something so serious.
Yeah.
The US will be harder to trust after this.
Yeah.
I was thinking as well, just a point we have here. I mean, has this arisen because ordinary people are becoming too technologically literate and have access to the immediate ability to make information public on a mass level? In the sense of, once it's on the internet, that's it.
Sorry, what was the question? Is this there?
In relation to the National Guardsman being able to just put this on his phone and put it on his Discord, do you think that this has arisen because, I mean, I say ordinary people, just normal people, they're becoming too technologically literate and have access to the internet, which gives them an immediate ability to make information public on a mass level, potentially?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Which I believe is why there's after the leaks, the statement was, "Oh, we don't have this on a digital server somewhere. It's been locked on was the safe or something." But anyways, they were trying to make the point that these documents don't exist in a digital form, and this is exactly why. Because once something is leaked, it it's very difficult to unleak it, because if it goes on the internet, it will stay forever, and it's impossible to control who views and who saves this information. So, for example, we save these documents on our PC. It's impossible for them to tell us to delete them. On the other side, if you don't digitize your documents, then you rely on humans, on people doing their job properly.
Yeah.
If this was a case of human error, well,
I mean, as well, I mean, you know, digitalization, if everything was on paper, there's still a danger. I mean, there was a case of an English security guard going into parts of the government building and just whipping out his camera phone and just taking photographs.
A traitor caught in the act. In these grainy images, David Smith, a security guard at the British Embassy in Berlin, is filming sensitive CCTV footage to send to his Russian paymasters. Little did he know he was facing an elaborate trap set for him by MI5.
If it was an embassy, they must recognise him. It's probably nothing to do with the embassy, but we should have done it.
He walked right in, and now will spend 13 years behind bars.
It was your job to ensure that the embassy was secure and its staff safe. You had access to restricted areas of the building at times when nobody else was likely to be there. When you did what you did, it was the most obvious breach of the trust placed in you.
Over several years, Smith passed sensitive information from the embassy, personal details of staff, a classified letter intended for the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, all to his Russian contacts.
You were fully aware that you should not have copied any of these documents, and were equally aware that were these documents to get into the wrong hands, they might harm British interests or pose a threat to the safety of people working at the embassy.
yeah, which is kind of what the leaks seems to be the case, because most of them are just pretty much hand-taken pictures via phone or a photograph.
Oh, yeah.
But,
I have no
like,
idea if... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go on.
I was going to say, I have no idea if these documents were originally digitalized or not, but as you say, this kid just walked in and took photographs. He walked...
Yeah,
well, he didn't just take photographs, he walked out with them.
Yeah, we can't know for sure if they've been digitalized or not, but you always have a trade-off when it comes to security. Whether you go one way or another, you cannot have perfect security.
One thing I'd like to say as well, though, it's, don't worry to the audience, it's nearly over, just a couple of more points. One thing that I get from this is diplomatic credibility has always been a factor in shaping US foreign policy. Even going back to 1945, the US shaped some of its foreign policy to be focused on its European allies and on its perception there, or, you know, rather how it was perceived there, and also to have a source of strength against a possible confrontation with the USSR in Europe. Back then it was to prevent the spread of communism, you know, even going to, you know, Vietnam. Now it could be a part of, you know, to expand NATO and really reinforce its strength. You know, during Vietnam, the US stayed in the conflict to maintain its support of its Asian allies, like the Thailand premier, who confirmed that he would abandon his pro-American stance should the Americans leave South Vietnam and Taiwan be overrun. Or, sorry, should South Vietnam be overrun and Taiwan be overrun by communist forces. A further example of this can also be seen with the Malaysian premier, who also showed concerns about South Vietnam being overrun. The idea that such considerations will link to increasing US intervention in Vietnam may have been demonstrated by Kennedy's taking the dominoes theory seriously in a television appearance in which he explained to the American people with maps concerning Laos. In addition, he increased financing, equipment, and the number of advisors in 1960. You know, US advisors numbered 900, and by 1961 they numbered 16,000, with economic aid, reaching 17 billion by 1961. Now, I know that seems a bit of a tangent because it's so long ago, but for different reasons, history's kind of repeating itself here. Do you not think?
Yeah.
You know, we're seeing a huge increase. Well, just to confirm, we don't know how much is being spent, but we've seen figures like 400 million be made public. These documents show the Americans want more money pumped into Ukraine. We've got Kennedy's strategy of sending advisors in or special forces in in these documents as well. And I think that, the credibility of the US, which it prides itself on being seen as a strong ally, these leaks have really dealt it a blow. What do you think?
I would agree that the leaks have, created a blow, as you said. Like the consequences of that is a bit too early to say, but I don't think we'll see anything big coming out of it.
Nah.
But it definitely made a lot of heads turn and made a lot of people angry.
Yeah. I think the big development from this is more, because I think the media will lose interest. I've already noticed on the news they're not talking about these leaks anymore. I think more likely I think what's more insightful is the view it's showed into NATO falling apart a bit in terms of, not being able to, we've seen a lot of exposure of just how unprepared NATO was, but we've already covered that earlier on. The last one I was going to say was, these leaks are going to give rise to so many conspiracy theories and misinformation. We're going to hear so many things come out of this. People say, well, these leaks show that there is like 1 million Americans now operating in Ukraine, and something ridiculous like that. People will use these leaks to justify so many claims.
Yeah, but getting concrete evidence to actually justify these leaks I don't think it's something that is easy.
No, absolutely true, yeah. I mean, our evidence of the, ineffective NATO intervention is journalists actually going into Ukraine and showing the evidence of it, and interviews with the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, Ukrainian medics, and Ukrainian soldiers actually talking about it,
Yeah.
Willie Ohm is a great source of material for that. In fact, just as an example, one of his stories is he was escorting a Ukrainian medical team, and all he had to give out was iodine tablets, like a jar of iodine tablets for each medical station.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And there's been all kinds of reports of no dust-off for casualties. So the NATO strategy is, obviously, someone gets wounded, you evac them on the ground, and then you have a helicopter come and take them away and get them to a field hospital. Most of the time, there aren't even ambulances coming for the wounded to get them to a place where they can be treated. So most of them are dying in medics' arms. While in comparison, the Russian model is you get shot, you go to the back. If they can treat you, they treat you. If not, you die. So that's also, I think, why the casualty rates are so high. But that's just an example of the kind of investigation you and I do, Jim. In terms of where we try to get our information from. But like I said, hopefully we've been very clear about what we thought was conspiracy theory and what we thought might be true. I have tried to speak with humility in saying, I just want to cover the actual podcast. It's still not confirmed what in these documents are true. This is just what they could imply. And there's been mixed messages from several governments. So just remember that we don't know everything in these documents is 100% true. This could could just be the insight that you could get from these documents. Is there anything else you want to add to this one, Jim?
Not really. No.
Okay. If you all enjoyed the podcast, go ahead and throw a like, hit the little bell, and subscribe. If you have something to add to the conversation, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Jim loves to argue. Hopefully you found this fascinating. Jim, anything?
No. Yeah.
Fair enough. This was the i5 podcast. I've been Jonathan, joined by Jim.
Yep. It's been a pleasure.
Yep. Have a nice night. It's night time here, but if it's night time where you are, have a nice night or have a nice day, guys. Bye now.
Yeah. All the best. Bye.